Hi, I'm Ben Graham, one of the co-founders of the Spec Lab, and this is our first video on regression. We're giving a math-free sort of intuition of regression set of lectures because statistics classes can be really daunting. They throw a lot of math at you. At the same time, they throw a lot of statistical programming at you, often with sort of losing the big picture. So you don't have the big picture to motivate you, and you're facing both math and statistical programming and intuition that you're trying to sort of get all at once. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take care of the intuition piece, and then we're going to take care of the statistical programming piece, so that when you go and take a statistics class and you would do the math, then you're just doing the math. You understand why you're doing it. The programming piece you kind of already get, and so you can just focus on the math. And the nice thing about the math that goes along with hypothesis testing and linear regression is that that math, I would sort of peg it right about high school algebra. It's not as hard as calculus, right? There's calculus sort of that sits underneath it, but you don't actually have to do the calculus, right? You need a little calculus intuition, or it helps to have some calculus intuition, but you don't actually have to do the chain rule or something like this, right? Like the math you actually have to do is really actually nice and pretty simple. We're mostly just working with the equation of a line, right? Which I guess is actually like middle school math, right? And then there's some slightly more complicated stuff. My point is the math's not too bad if we can put all these other pieces around it. It's also the case that you don't need to know the math to be a really good research assistant, right? To really help scholars with the grunt work of statistical programming and quantitative analysis, right? If you understand the big picture and you can do the statistical programming piece, then the professor you're working with can specify the regression equation, and you can do everything else, right? You can prep and merge the data the way we've worked with. You can actually run the regressions, you can make the regression tables, and you can make beautiful figures that that visualize and communicate the meaning that we've extracted from the analysis. So that's where we're headed with these videos today. Okay, so the first thing that regression is that it's prediction, right? There's some dependent variable, some outcome we're trying to predict, and we have an equation that we use to predict it, right? So I bought car insurance recently, and the insurance company is using information about my age, my gender, whether or not I'm married, how much money I make, what zip code I live in, to predict whether or not I'm going to get in a car crash, right? And so it's just a predicted probability, and they have a regression equation that they use to do that, right? And then they use that predicted probability to set the price I have to pay for my car insurance. So this is prediction. They don't care what causes what, but they want a good predicted probability for the crash so they can set a price. It's also a tool for hypothesis testing. And if you're working in an academic lab, right, you're going to be doing a lot of hypothesis testing, right? We have theories about how the world works, and we want to know if we're right or not. So we have some treatment variable, some cause, and we have some outcome, and we're trying to relate the two. We're trying to figure out whether decentralizing policy authority over education leads to better or worse educational attainment outcomes, right? So we're trying to do this causal inference. And we're not going to get too deep into the weeds of causal inference. You guys have heard correlation does not equal causation. We're not going to get too deep into that, but we're going to look at this sort of correlation analysis, the regression analysis, as one of the tools of causal inference. When we're doing linear regression or any type of regression analysis in the social sciences, we're working on some sample of data, right? So we don't in general have data on the whole population we're interested in. We have some theory about how the whole world works, or how countries like this work, or how populations of this nature work. And then we've got data on some subset of that population. So we're doing analysis, trying to explain variation in the outcome in our little sample, or sometimes our big sample, but in our sample. And then we're trying to use what we found out about the relationships in this sample here to make inferences back to the population. So we drew some sample from the population, we studied that sample and collected data and analyzed data on that sample, and then we're trying to make inferences back to the population. Okay, so two key things we're going to kind of anchor. We've got our dependent variable. This is our Y variable. This is our outcome of interest. This is what we're trying to explain, what we're trying to predict, right? So we've got projects ongoing in the lab right now looking at the onset of civil war. kind of the 0 or 1 outcome in a given country in a given year. The existence of democracy in a given country or a given year, right? Is democracy surviving? Are we moving from autocracy to democracy? Or are we moving from democracy to autocracy? So we're looking at this regime type outcome. We're looking at the level of educational attainment for different populations in different countries, right? One of the key measures we're working with in a paper right now is the proportion of 15 to 19-year-old females who have completed secondary school, right? Higher educational attainment is when a higher proportion of females in this age group have completed secondary school. And we've got other projects where we look at the level of inward foreign direct investment, how much foreign capital is coming into a developing country, right? So these are the kinds of outcomes we're trying to predict, we're trying to explain. We're testing hypotheses about the causes of these outcomes. We're doing all those things with regression analysis. But we have also our independent variables of interest, right? These are our causal variables. So this is our X variable, the treatment variables. You can think about like, this is, do you get Tylenol or do you get the placebo, right? Do you get subnational control of education policy or centralized central government, national government control, right? So this is our key treatment variable. It's our cause, right? So when we're looking at the occurrence of civil war, we might be looking at the presence of oil wealth or the level of constraining power sharing as some of those causal variables. Similarly, with those regime type outcomes, we've done a lot of work on the level of constraining power sharing as a cause of regime type. We look at the level of subnational policy authority, right, as a cause of educational attainment, the security of property rights as a cause of inward flows of foreign capital, right? So we've got these causal variables that we're trying to measure, and then that we're trying to relate to these outcomes. So that's what's going on in regression analysis, right? So we're predicting these Y variables, right, using the information in our X variables. We're explaining the variation in our outcome variable based on variation in our independent variable. So our variation in our dependent variable is explained by variation in our independent variable. We're making inferences about the relationship between X and Y in the whole population based on the relationship between X and Y that we can observe within the sample, right? And we're testing hypotheses about the effect of these treatment variables, these X variables, on our outcome variables, right? And we're saying, can we reject the null hypothesis? So we have some hypothesis that greater subnational authority over education leads to better educational attainment. Well, the null hypothesis here is that there's no relationship. And we want to see, can we reject that null hypothesis, right? Do we find support for our theory that X causes Y? That's what we're doing. Stay with me.